Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Brown Bag, Augusta, and the 19th Amendment. You are in for a treat today. As always, I always give you a national day, and today is National Umbrella Day. If you're anything like me, it seems like your umbrella is never where you need it to be. If you're in the car, it's at the house. If you're at home, it's in the car, and so on and so forth. So do yourself a favor, get multiple umbrellas, put them in different places. As for today's speaker, we have Miss Deb Presnell. She has served as a member of the Richmond County Board of Health and the League of Women Voters of the CSRA since 2016. And she's been its treasurer for over 2 years. So she is more than qualified to teach us all about Augusta and the 19th Amendment. We're so glad to have had her recording with us. I hope you all enjoyed this talk. Thank you.
Very pleased to be here today to share with you information about suffragists of Augusta in the struggle for the 19th Amendment. I am Deb Presnell. I am treasurer for the League of Women Voters of the CSRA. I have been a member for about 4 years. Our chapter was reorganized in the last 5 to 6 years. But there has been earlier chapters of the League in Augusta. In putting together the exhibit, I want to, before I begin, to thank my colleagues from the League and elsewhere. They would be Joyce Law, a local historian for African American history, Rose Castleberry, Teresa McVeigh, Gayla Kesey, Catherine Williams, and Jan Parsons. These ladies either contributed information resources by their own research or contributed their possessions for the exhibit that we had here last year. I'd also like to thank Augusta Blueprint for their technical advice and for printing up some of the plaques that were used in the exhibit. The exhibit came about last year. The year 2020 was, among many other things, the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote, and also the League of Women Voters. We started with a poor copy of a photograph, which we were never able to get the better copy, better print of. This was a picture of ladies in front of St. Paul's Church, which is not far from here. And while you can't see the faces hardly or see much in this photo, you can read the banner, which says League of Women Voters Convention, Augusta, May 14th, 1921, Purity in Politics. And you can also read the caption, which gave us some names. So that's where we started. This is the end, but not the beginning. So with that, I will begin with one of the earliest of our suffragists. But before I do, I would like to draw your attention to this photograph. This is Helene Augusta Howard from Columbus, Georgia, and she organized in 1890, that's the year we shall begin, the first women's suffrage league in Georgia. Mind you, the movement had started in 1848, which most people know of Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who established the movement and convened the first National Women's Rights Convention in 1850. And in 1851, a year later, Susan B. Anthony has joined the movement, and this is when Sojourner Truth delivers her "Ain't I a Woman" speech before a women's rights convention in Akron, Ohio. So, slowly but surely, this information has come to Georgia, and we have Miss Howard. in the next year, we have an organization started in 4 years. The Equal Suffrage Party started in Atlanta, Georgia, at the home of Emily McDougall. So our earliest suffragist that we were able to find from Augusta was Miss Gertrude Ella Clancy Thomas. She was born in 1834. She was the daughter of a wealthy planter, and she married a wealthy planter. This is Miss Thomas. Her father saw her interest in education and sent her to a boarding school. I believe it was in Macon, Georgia, and but she's most famous for a diary that she kept from 1848 to 1889, and this diary is now was bought by is held in the Duke University Library. They bought it in 1957. After the exhibit and the rest of the research that went into the exhibit, I was able to get a copy of this book. The name of the book is Suffer and Grow Strong, and it's based on a dissertation that the author did on these diaries, and she was asked to develop it more, and she did in this book, and it's very interesting. I hope you'll get a copy, and it takes some time to read this. After her good fortune of being born into wealth, and after the Civil War, Miss Thomas suffered greatly, hence the title, Suffer and Grow Strong. Her husband was not a good businessman, even though they owned lots of property, several houses. In fact, her father had built a mansion on Green Street here in Augusta, and they had to resort to using it as a boarding house at one point. But they couldn't make grow their wealth anymore from their land. Obviously, after the Civil War, there was insufficient slave labor to make the plantations as productive as they had been. So her husband invested in, he also had brought plantations up from Burke County. The Thomas family, or the Clancy family, had farms in Columbia County, Augusta, Burke County. It was very widespread, but they couldn't make it productive. He invested in a business in Augusta with some other gentlemen, which failed miserably. He never was able to make money. And in fact, they borrowed money, or he borrowed money from her family, from his family, from friends. They ended up losing everything. Ms. Thomas had, I believe, 10 children, and of course, not all of them lived through infancy. When they lost finally the very last home place of hers in this area, they moved to Atlanta, where she had a younger son who had become a doctor, a physician, and that's where he was located. And as a matter of fact, her older son at the same time was suing her. So she had seen her family members, even her own children, sue her, which actually was quite common in the day, to settle disputes over property and such. But nevertheless, it was hurtful. And it was when she moved to Atlanta that she became acquainted with Mary Latimer McClendon. Mary Latimer McClendon is known as the mother of suffrage in Georgia, and there is a statue of her in the Georgia Capitol. But before she became a suffragist, and this was true for many of the women of the time, they were involved with the Women's Christian Temperance Union. So Ms. Thomas was giving speeches on behalf of the Temperance Union, and that is no doubt how she made friends with Ms. Latimer, and because women were trying to protect themselves and children, and through their various family trials, it was obvious why they would also be attracted to the idea of suffrage and having the vote, because it meant helping to determine their future and determining policies that affected them directly, such as, prohibition or the sale of alcohol, and in some cases their very lives were affected directly. So Ms. Thomas became a president of the sorry. She became a president of the league in Atlanta, the Georgia Suffrage League, in 1906. This was shortly before she died, and Ms. Latimer McClendon, Ms. McClendon had been president early on, up to that point, and then later, after Ms. Thomas died, McClendon took the role over again for that purpose. A somewhat of a contemporary of Miss Thomas is our own Lucy Craft Laney. Ms. Laney was an educator, and she's well known in this area because we have a museum that's dedicated to Ms. Laney's achievements and efforts here in Augusta. In 1917, she established the Augusta chapter of the NAACP, and but during the years that she was involved, like the 1890s, she started a kindergarten for African American children. So her activities around education paralleled the activities of other women who were seeking suffrage about that time. There was, I would say, an awakening. But mind you, there was always, especially in the South, a struggle over suffrage that tended to exclude black women from their participation. There was a anti-suffrage movement which began in out of Macon, Georgia, and they were very vehemently, and one of the reasons that they didn't want suffrage for women was it would enfranchise African Americans or black people. But there were notable black women throughout the struggle nationally, and as I said before, Gertrude had given her speech as far back as 1851 on Ain't I a Woman. So they too recognized the need to become enfranchised, as they called it, for the vote. But I'd like to point out, back before the 19th Amendment came about, there was a 15th Amendment, which gave black men a right to vote. And there's been a lot written about what happened amongst the suffrage movement. In fact, the organizations that were in place at that time split. And they split because of a difference of opinion as to that amendment. And while they didn't want to, especially Susan B. Anthony, didn't want to disenfranchise black people, she was adamant about universal suffrage, which would have included white women, black men, just universal suffrage. And because they only gave the vote to black men, and of course this was prior to or just after the Civil War, and Reconstruction changed a lot of that, and the organizations, the women split, and so they were two organizations for suffrage, but eventually they reunited and continued to march forward toward their goal. But I want to point out that Ms. Laney is also is noted as a suffragist, a significant suffragist for the Turning Point Memorial, which you can look up, which is the Turning Point Suffragist Memorial, I might add. Okay, so now we come to the early 1900s, and this is when the suffrage movement starts to really heat up. Alice Paul she had been educated in England and was very familiar with the English or British suffragists and their ways. And she was a bit of a militant figure to the women here in the United States. And her tactics, which included banners and picketing, was particularly picketing at the White House, where our own Woodrow Wilson was then president. She picketed, and that also upset some of the long-term leaders of the suffragist movement. They weren't particularly enthused about those methods, and she formed a different organization, the Congressional Union. They separated for a while, and then you start seeing not just suffrage league associations, but equal suffrage parties. And so due to that influence, the pending World War I, women are getting active, women are getting out to support their men who are going into service, and sons and brothers and whatnot. So that's where women are out more, there are more parades, etc. So at this time, I'm coming around to the photograph that I shared with you earlier. I started with that photograph. I looked up some of these names, and I found a woman by the name of Annie G. Wright, and I wondered about her. She was Miss Annie G. Wright, and when I looked up her genealogical information, I found that she had grown up in a household. Her father apparently died, and this we know, that he died. He was an editor of the Augusta Chronicle, and he died, and she had to go to work because the father didn't leave sufficient funds for the family. And she was listed as having a job as society editor at one point, but she eventually became an insurance agent, and she boarded all over town. And one home she boarded with were the Norths. And when she reached middle age, she had worked herself up to be a district manager for this insurance company. And she bought a home. She bought a home at 935 Hickman Road, and she brought 2 wards. In the first instance, when I saw this, I thought, a single woman with 2 sons, with 2 orphan sons, or boys, because the names were Wallace and Neville. And later, in another entry on a census form, I realized they were actually young girls. And Wallace North and Neville North were her wards. Their parents had been killed, and she was being so familiar with the family and having lived with them, she brought the 2 young women to her home and brought them up as her wards. There is an entry that we found excuse me. We found an entry for Miss Ward in that photograph, and with the genealogical research and with some other efforts of my colleagues and I, there are several guidebooks in the Georgia room of the downtown library, and we found a write-up in that and my earliest indication of her involvement, we found a write-up about Miss Wright in that one of those guidebooks. But my earliest indication was of her being involved was 1914, and it was in 1914 that she was the secretary for the Georgia Women's Suffrage League. In March 1916, we found an article, and the article states that the headline for this article is that the Georgia Women's Suffrage Association gives up Augusta as a hopeless proposition. And this was in March of 1914, and the Georgia, it says here from Atlanta, Georgia, "We have given up Augusta as a hopeless proposition," said Miss Mary McClendon, president of the Georgia Women's Suffrage Association today. "We've tried for years to get a suffrage organization established there, but they are too old-fashioned. They are to Georgia like the people of Massachusetts are to the United States, hopelessly old-fashioned in reference to equal suffrage," which statement Augusta is welcome to interpret either as a knock or a boost as it desires. Well, apparently this type of publicity had its effect as a boost, because by September of the same year, the Women's Suffrage Party was organized in Augusta. And I'll read just the beginning of that article. "It is a pity that every man in Augusta could not have been present yesterday afternoon at the organization of the Women's Suffrage Party in Augusta, for it would have been a lesson to them in parliamentary usage and in the smooth and successful manner in which women conduct their meetings. And if they can manage everything they undertake in the same perfect manner, they may be safely trusted with the ballot." And so at that point, I'm sure Miss Annie G. Wright continued to be as active as she was throughout. In May and June of 1916, she was treasurer. By September, and when the suffrage party had been organized, she was elected secretary, and she traveled to Atlantic City, New Jersey, and New York State for the suffrage convention. In April 1917, Anna Howard Shaw, because of Miss Wright's efforts, comes to Augusta. Anna Howard Shaw was the first female Methodist minister, and I read a little bit about her. She was denied dormitory facilities and had to pay out of pocket for facilities when she went to divinity school because she was a woman. So it cost her more to become that minister. But, of course, her parents were horrified, but she proceeded nevertheless. In March of 1918, Miss Wright talks to the House Council of the Young Christian Women's Association. By April of that year, the very next month, she's become auditor of the Women's Suffrage Association. In May 19th, there was a Founders Day parade, or a bond parade. Sometimes they had parades to raise money for the war effort. And in this particular instance, there is a picture which I can share of an example of parading. Here is Miss Latimer driving Anna Howard Shaw's car, which she had bought, and this was in Atlanta, and 1913, and she's at the wheel. And Ms. McClendon is 73 years old at this time. It reminds me of a birthday card where my eyesight is bad, my hearing's no good, but I can still drive. Here is a picture of Miss Lucy Craft Laney, whom I've already mentioned. And here is a picture of Miss Annie G. Wright. And of course, her activities were such that by the time of our little hardly readable photograph, she had brought the first convention of the League of Georgia to Augusta. And that was in front of St. Paul's Church, which I may have said. Now I would like to read a bit about Ms. Wright from the guidebooks that we found at the library. Miss Anna G. Wright from Augusta was the first president of the League of Women Voters of Georgia. She was no typical woman of the era, League officials say. She had been very active in the suffrage movement and had many friends throughout the country. Miss Wright was the daughter of Henry Gregory Wright, editor of the Augusta Chronicle in the 1880s. After the death of her father, Miss Wright received a small inheritance and had to support herself by selling insurance. Under Miss Wright's administration, the League's first state convention was held in Augusta. She was instrumental to bring the National League of Women Voters to Atlanta for a regional conference in 1921. Wallace North, a family friend and also her ward, wrote the following memoir. If ever there was a rip-snorting suffragette, Annie Wright was one. Vigorous, bright, and compassionate, her big aim in life was to help enfranchise the women of these United States. She used to say she had a lot of fight in her because she was the granddaughter of Confederate General Ambrose Wright. Miss Wright was a close friend of the Phil North family and lived in their home. Through her influence, the older daughter, Wallace North, became a suffragist at age 8. Because of the discussions which took place in the home, Wallace and her little sister, Neville, became familiar with the big names in the battle to win votes for women. Almost like friends were Susan B. Anthony, Carrie Chapman Catt, Dr. Annie Howard Shaw, and the Parkhurst family in England. In Georgia were Eleanor Raoul and Ms. Emily McDougall, and in Aiken, South Carolina, Eulalie Sally. And I believe it was Eulalie Sally who paraded by riding a horse on behalf of suffragists and for the suffrage movement. Young women who casually cast their votes today have no idea of what the suffragists endured for 70-odd years in their struggle to give women a voice in government, to free them from taxation without representation and other discriminatory measures which placed them in an inferior position. To ladies who were indifferent to the ideas of women voting or who were laughing at the suffragists, Annie Wright would say, "Do you know who can't vote in this country? Criminals, idiots, and women. Do you like being in that class?" She was positive in what she had to say, but she was never rude. It took a tragedy in Augusta to wake up the complacent ladies who saw no point in women's suffrage. A young woman, a member of a prominent family, was killed in a car accident. The fortune she inherited shortly before her death was, by Georgia law, divided between her father and 2 siblings. The mother who brought her into the world received not a penny. So it was these kinds of instances which happened to women all over the country which brought them around to the suffrage movement. So while I've shared with you some of the more outstanding figures locally, there were other women. We don't know quite as much about them, but I would like to share with you, and they also were in the picture that I shared at the beginning of my talk. By the way, the amendment was ratified. The amendment was ratified in August of 1920, but women in Augusta, in fact, Georgia, it required a certain number of states. Those certain number of states ratified, I believe Tennessee was the last, to pass the amendment. But Georgia didn't ratify the amendment until 1970. Nevertheless, women couldn't vote in the very next election after August 1920 because they had to have registered 6 months before, and 6 months before they weren't allowed to. So they did get to vote, and the League of Women Voters was formed after the ratification of the amendment. When all these other organizations, the Women's Suffrage Association, or the Equal Suffrage Party, all combined to become the League of Women Voters. And their goal is to educate voters and to make sure that nobody is denied the right to vote. We're often, lately particularly, accused of being democratic, as if we, but the League is a nonpartisan organization. If some of our activities appear to support democracy, then so be it. That is why we're often labeled as being democratic. But it's not a party affiliation. It's because of our positions on the right of everyone to vote and to be an educated voter. So back to some of the other women in the photograph. One of the ladies who had been president while Miss Wright had been secretary, treasurer, auditor, and eventually president of the state of the League itself, Mrs. Standard B. Owens is cited in many articles as being president. And in later times, she was not known as Mrs. Standard B. Owens, but Mrs. Mary Mead Owens. And briefly, Ms. Owens was born in 1870 in Kentucky, but by the 1910s, she resided in Augusta and was an ardent supporter of women's suffrage. In 1916, she was elected to the executive board of the Equal Suffrage Party of Georgia. In 1918, she served as president of the Equal Suffrage League of Augusta and sent a letter or telegram to a congressional investigating committee on behalf of the League's 800 members, urging passage of the Susan B. Anthony Amendment to the Constitution. In 1920, she was admitted to the Pratt Institute School of Library Science in New York City. 10 years later, she appears in the Augusta census, white, 59, divorced, and living with her cousin J. Rice Smith, and working as a public school librarian. In 1940, now 70 years old, she lived alone in the George Walton Apartments in Augusta, still working as a librarian. The census noted that she had completed 2 years of college, consistent with her earlier record of attending library school in New York City. That is a very smooth, in my opinion, account of Ms. Owens, but I had also looked up some of the genealogy information early on and was curious. It appeared to me that she had been divorced, even though I couldn't pinpoint it. But I could see that after the divorce, she went to school and became a librarian. And it's no doubt her work as a librarian that familiarized her with another lady in the photograph, which is Miss Julia Fleisch. Ms. Fleisch was born in 1861 and died in 1941. She was an advocate for, known as an advocate for young women's rights, education, and independence. She published articles in the Augusta Chronicle as early as 1882 while she was attending Cooper's Union in New York City. In 1899, she was, the University of Georgia at Athens awarded her an honorary degree, and this was 20 years after they denied her admission to that university. In 1908, after attending Cambridge, she actually was in Milledgeville at the Women's College there, and she had been invited to help with a curriculum development and a dedication for the school. And she taught stenography there and typing, and then served as a history professor from 1891 to 1905. She enrolled in summer classes at Harvard University and at the University of Chicago, and then she got the honorary degree from University of Georgia, and she left Milledgeville to enroll at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, where she studied under Frederick Jackson Turner and Ulrich Bonnell Phillips, and that's where she earned her bachelor's and master's degree in history. And when she returned to Augusta in 1908, she resumed teaching history at the Tubman High School for Girls. She was a devoted teacher and role model, actively lobbying for women's suffrage and state grants for women's higher education. Moreover, she was a woman ahead of her time who advocated collective bargaining rights for teachers. She served as Dean of Women and Professor of History at the Junior College of Augusta, later Augusta University, after its founding in 1925, until failing eyesight forced her into retirement in 1936. She remained in Augusta until her death on March 17, 1941. So I am sure that Ms. Meade Owens knew Ms. Fleisch pretty well, because one was a librarian and one was an educator, and they surely crossed paths several times. The other woman in the photograph that we were able to obtain some information on was Mrs. Ls Arrington. She was the wife of a prominent wholesale merchant in Augusta, and her activities also were related to church work. She was very interested in social services, so she held positions with the Women's Missionary Council along those lines, and with the Women's Club she was chairman of Applied Education. I'm not familiar with how they organized. She wasn't an officer, but she was a chairman of an area of interest, one of several that the Women's Club maintained. She was listed in a book called Women in American Politics, Volume 1. She was also a pioneer club woman through her membership in the Philomathic Club as its president from 1901 to 1903. And when she was president of the Equal Suffrage Party in 1916, that was when Miss Annie G. Wright was treasurer. And that was after the organization came about here in Augusta. Shortly after the 19th Amendment was ratified, there was an article printed in the Augusta Chronicle, a year later, in August 1921. This was after a year after when women in Augusta were allowed to vote because they could register. There was an article about she and another woman, and the headline reads, "Two women did something unique this day in 1921. They gained an Augusta public office. Two women did something unique this day in 1921. They gained an Augusta public office. With newly passed federal and state laws opening such opportunities, Augusta's Civil Service Commission showed an enlightened example of fair play when two of its 5 members offered to resign so that women could now be appointed in their places. Some questioned if women would be comfortable dealing with the often rancorous city board that governed police and firemen activities, but many, including the Chronicle's editorial page, said it would be an improvement. M. H. Duvall and Edward J. Lyon agreed to step aside to make the change happen. It was determined that local women's clubs would suggest the candidates to be appointed, and Mrs. Ls Arrington and Mrs. Harry Carpenter were nominated. Both were approved at the August 2nd council meeting, and the mayor swore them in the following morning. And then I was able to determine that a year later she became chairman of that same board. I forgot exactly how that came about, but they obviously saw her abilities, and due to her club activities, no doubt, she knew how to handle and set an agenda and continue in that role. So then we come to the 1921 when women can vote, and it was Joyce Law who, the League has had several of its March equalities at the Lucy Craft Laney Museum. And one of the first, Joyce Law had made a poster for us. And the poster was of all the women who voted in Augusta at that time. It included Miss Lucy Craft Laney, of course, and many of these other ladies. And to me, that was just fascinating that they were listed in that way. I have just a copy here of the long list of the poster. We had it included in our exhibit here. You can see there are many names. And there were articles, the registry list of women voters was printed in the Augusta Chronicle. So I wanted to especially point that out, that the women saw, many of the women who started with the movement early on were unable to see the results of their activities. They didn't live long enough. It was a 70-year struggle, but fortunately many did. And I'm very happy to have learned about these ladies and what they were able to do. And I thank you for allowing me this opportunity.